okay. That's okay. Okay, we'll make a start here. So this part of the talk is devoted to the microscopic aspects of colorectal cancer reporting as things stand. So once again, this is based heavily on the Royal College document, which has been recently revised and that I was involved in. And this has adopted TNM8 with all its changes. This was a big change from UK practice because we were working off TNM5 before that. Were you adopting each, were you TNM7 and then 8? Yeah. Yeah, but before we had 5, 7. So we got 20 years worth of changes at once because of course we adopted all the intervening bits, so that was a big impact for us. So we've done all that and now we're a quarter of the way through. Basically here, but it won't take us as long to do the second part. The other document that is about to come out, they keep delaying it, is the update to this WHO Blue Book on GI. So it's going to be the GI version is going to be the first of the 5th series of WHO Blue Books, and they said it would be out for Christmas, they said it would be out in January. There's some delays, but the book is complete and I know pretty much what's in it, but it's just not actually available just yet. So there are important things in there. A lot of it maybe is more to do with changes in things like serrated polyps and classification and that are really a bit beyond scope for today. But there are some changes in the colorectal cancer section itself that are worth knowing about. So if we just kind of methodically go through the different areas that we're going to be diagnosing and address each of them individually, spending a bit more time on some of the more complicated ones. So to start off with, obviously we're typing our tumours histologically, and the vast majority of them are adenocarcinoma. It's not otherwise specified, but there's a long list of various subtypes, of which mucinous and signet ring cell would be 2 common examples. And we basically follow the WHO system, which will be unchanged, which is you need 50% to qualify for application of that specific subtype. So not infrequently we see a tumour that is a component that's just conventional adenocarcinoma and a component that's mucinous, and it should have 50% intracellular mucin to qualify for calling it a mucinous carcinoma with the connotations that go with that. The important point is that the differentiation grading is really only applicable to the adenocarcinoma NOS category. So strictly speaking, it's a mucinous carcinoma, grading and differentiation doesn't actually add anything. We should note that we adopt a two-grade system for differentiation in our college data set as opposed to the 4-grade WHO. So basically reproducibility we think is just if we lump well and moderate together versus low and very, very undifferentiated carcinoma, then we've got a system that I think is probably better reproducibility. But I would say the most important thing is when you call something purely differentiated adenocarcinoma, I think that should trigger another test. Any ideas what I'm getting at? If you call something purely differentiated adenocarcinoma, I think mismatch repair immunohistochemistry or MSI status is important because that totally changes the prognosis or the impact for that patient. I'll talk more about MSI later on, but if you have something that looks pretty differentiated, it could well behave like a low-grade tumour, clinically non-aggressive. It's MSI high, if it's mismatch repair deficient, so I think that's an important thing. And we recommend in the Royal College data set to do assessment of MSI status in any case that we want to call pretty differentiated or mucinous. Okay, so you're all aware that the TNM stage is the single most important prognostic factor in colorectal cancer, and that's divided into T, M, and M stage to try and give an assessment of progression, and they're fairly straightforward. So the PT1 tumour confined to submucosa, PT2 into muscularis propria but not beyond, PT3 beyond muscularis propria, and they've called this PT4, I'm not quite sure it is actually, it doesn't really reach the serosal surface, but that's a distinguishing line, and so we don't apply a 1 mm rule here, we need to see tumour cells on the serosal surface before calling it PT4. TNM8, that's PT4A, so that was a reversal from earlier TNM versions where we had PT4B used to be serosal infiltration, and then they swapped it around because basically SEER data from America showed that unsurprisingly margin involvement was associated with a worse, adjacent organ involvement was associated with a worse outcome and prognosis compared to just serosal penetration. So usually serosal penetration will come before adjacent organ involvement, with the exception of low rectal tumours that maybe don't ever get into the peritoneal cavity but do infiltrate into adjacent organs such as vagina or bladder. Okay, so TNM changes in interpretation. So that's one example where we've got a change in the T stage, but much more contentious and important is the evolution of interpretation of foci of discontinuous tumour within mesorectal and mesocolic fat. And I think it's worth looking at the history here, because this is a very important subject as to if you have tumour that's not connected to the primary, how do we interpret that? And I think there's been moves, very positive moves in TNM8, but how have we got to this point? So the TNM5 rule was this arbitrary but at least reproducible 3mm measurement, whereby any of these discontinuous tumour foci that measure 3mm or more, unless it was clearly related to a vein, you called it a lymph node. So that's what we were doing for 20 years in UK practice, because we were stuck in TNM5 because we didn't really like the changes that TNM6 or 7 introduced. So TNM6 in 2002 got rid of the 3mm rule and replaced it with this lymph node is round, EMVI is irregular, very arbitrary, pretty difficult to assume. So was TNM6 in practice here? Were you trying to do this for 7 years? How easy was it in practice? Or was the increased migration, has it affected practice much? Your change from one TNM stage to the next? What have you noticed different about it? Maybe you're all too young to So TNM6 basically did not go down well with a bunch of eminent pathologists across Europe, and these were the issues. Basically, they thought TNM were just bringing these changes about without good evidence of reproducibility, or who's making these rules up. And we do know the evidence for the change. Perhaps most importantly, all these pathologists are heavily involved in trials and registries, and we were introducing, or TNM were trying to introduce changes which would cause havoc with comparison of data sets between different trials or between different data sets without the ability to make sure that what you're comparing is analogous, and perhaps more importantly, potentially changing patients' treatment without a strong evidence base. So undeterred, TNM then made a load of more changes in TNM7, including introducing the term tumour deposit for the first time. But the definition of tumour deposit, which I'll show shortly, was quite different from TNM8. And again, I'd be curious to know, because you're definitely not all too young to know the difference between TNM7 and 8. So has the change from 7 to 8 impacted much? I think it should have. I think tumour deposits are a different animal under TNM8 than TNM7. And it's because of this subtle but important point, whereby in TNM7 they said that some tumour deposits may represent venous invasion. I thought, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that you can call these things venous invasion if you see a wisp of a vein, or you can't? So that's the sort of thing that was clarified in the TNM8 definition, and that persuaded the powers that be, certainly in UK practice, to accept it. So the white bit is the TNM7 definition of tumour deposit, and then the yellow bit was added in TNM8. It's worth spending a bit of time digesting this slide, I think. So tumour deposits or satellites are discrete macroscopic or microscopic nodules of cancer within the pericolorectal adipose tissues lymph drainage area of a primary carcinoma. So this is not something you can't have a tumour deposit miles away, that's distant metastatic disease, that's end-stage territory. This has to be within the lymph node drainage area, so within the mesocolon or mesorectum, essentially. And so they have to be discontinuous from the primary and without any histological evidence of either residual lymph node or any of these other structures. So this was the big change. Suddenly, if you see a vessel wall on routine or other stains, then you call it venous invasion, or potentially lymphatic invasion, although that's quite rare. Or a tumour deposit may relate to a neural structure. So if you see perineural invasion in association with a tumour deposit, you're meant to call these, classify these under the V, L or PL category rather than tumour deposits. To add to the confusion, that you only actually call tumour deposits, or you only influence the end stage if there are no overt or conventional lymph node mets. And this is particularly contentious for reasons that I'll demonstrate. So again, the yellow fields are those changes from TNM7 to TNM8. So greater with huge amounts of data, because colorectal cancer is so common. There's a lot of patients out there with good data, and population-based registries have shown that you can stratify outcome depending on the number of nodal mets. So we've got N1A, N1B, N2A, N2E for the number of conventional nodal mets. But then this interesting category of N1C. So it was decided that if you have no overt nodal mets, but you have tumour deposits, that your prognosis was probably similar to around what patients with N1B or N2A had. So this is where they slotted it in. Okay, so what about applying this in practice? So I've got a lot of mileage out of this one slide. I have to say it's kind of a lot of time digesting it in talks, and I think it's very informative. And I have to say, since I first put this together, my approach to interpreting or applying this in routine practice has changed, and I'll describe how. So basically, this is somebody with a PT3, I can't even remember now, it's colonic or rectal, I think colonic tumour, and all these foci, and this of course wasn't isolated, there were other slides like this, but lots of discontinuous tumour within their mesentery. And I think if we look at interpreting each of these areas and try and decide how we would call them, then it's informative. Because remember, we have to try and get towards reproducibility here, both of the modes that we might use to reach a conclusion and to try and standardise how we're actually classifying these. Start off with an easy one. What's that? So, venous invasion. Yeah. So if you want, you can do an elastin, or I find Desmond steel very helpful in a lot of situations. You can get a wisp of Desmond positivity around lymph node capsules sometimes, but this kind of thick, continuous Desmond has always been as well. But you don't really need it because you've got red blood cells in a lumen. So that's clearly extramural venous invasion. Put it down here. This is probably something similar, but you don't have a lumen anymore. You do have this widowed arteriole here, and that's often a common sign. And there's this pink stuff here that's probably vein wall muscle, and you might use a Desmond or elastic stain to help us with that. And again, I can see the elastic staining helping or providing some support for interpreting this again as extramural venous invasion. But what about this focus? So here, well, what do you think of this? Hands up who would call that extramural venous invasion. Hands up who would call that a tumour deposit. Tumour deposit? Okay. So some people might say that the widowed arteriole, this must be a destroyed vein. I agree with you all. I'm not just saying that because you went for tumour deposit, because I think if you don't call this tumour deposit, then what would you call it? There's no evidence either in H&E or elastin or Desmond of any residual venous structure. And so, of course, this may have arisen within the vein, and then the vein is completely destroyed. But I think this, for me, meets the current TNM8 definition for a tumour deposit. A little bit up here. I think this is something similar. That this is all irregular. There's nothing much on elastin. The problem here is that TNM8 doesn't give you any criteria for minimum size or distance between tumour deposit. So if you think this is tumour deposit, is it 1, is it 2, is it 3? Does it matter? Well, we shall see. So I think these are tumour deposits. I have no idea how many because we're not given any guidance. So if you didn't have any other involvement, this would be N1C. Okay? So we go down here. And this is an interesting field because here we have clear cut, even without any stains, venular involvement again. We can see this muscle wall, this is running alongside the artery, so that looks like EMVI. Anybody spot any other metastatic pathway that's engaged in that slide? This area. So that looks like another, some sort of a channel. We don't have red blood cells in there, we do have lymph, and we do have white blood cells, and all these tumour cells. So that looks like a lymphatic channel. So that looks like lymphatic invasion to me. And what stain would we use to confirm that? Do you use it much? D240? Yeah, so I don't know where it disappeared. I had an image of that alongside it. That can be very useful, very specific for lymphatic endothelial cells, and can be very useful, say, in a PT1 setting for picking up very subtle lymphatic invasion. Talk more than that. Okay, so then lastly, we have this lymph node. Yeah, I think so as well. So we've got a capsule and we have subcapsular lymphoid tissue. We don't have a sinus, but I agree entirely that there's enough evidence there. So of course it's almost completely replaced, but I think that's a lymph node. Elastin doesn't really show anything that might make you think it's a vein. So this, of course, now jumps the patient from N1C back to N1A because you ignore the tumour deposits. So, just for completeness, an S100 showing complete lack of engagement with any tumour, so there's no evidence of any perineural spread here. I have to say perineural is not something I was ever kind of looking for until TNM8 came out. But when you do see it often in nastier tumours, especially in the rectum, and they'll show you some evidence that it's of significance. It's not something that I was ever kind of tuned into, and I think this case I think is clearly a nasty case, but it's not that uncommon. So what we're seeing for this particular tumour is venous invasion, lymphatic invasion, lymph node mets, and tumour deposits, and under TNM8 that would be PT3, N1A, V1, and you would probably also mention the tumour deposits, I think. So the significance clinically of tumour deposits is now absolutely clear. Evidence like this, meta-analysis, 17 studies, over 10,000 patients, 22% of them showed tumour deposits invariably associated with poorer outcome, disease-free survival, and overall survival. So unsurprisingly, when you find tumour deposits, you also tend to find these other adverse features, and I guess that's because the tumour deposits have to have arisen really by one or other of these mechanisms. But importantly, they are of independent prognostic value on multivariate analysis, which I'll come back to. So what about potentially using the tumour deposits to identify the type of recurrent or metastatic disease that the patient may develop? So it's amazing how old this paper is. Neil Goldstein produced this way back in 2000, and this was a series of patients with nodal disease and PT3. Hello. And he knew about the pattern of recurrent disease in these patients. So we found tumour deposits in 18% of cases, but interestingly, in 44% of patients with tumour deposits, they get peritoneal disease, but in those without tumour deposits, only 12%. So are tumour deposits some sort of marker of increased risk of peritoneal disease? Also interestingly, Neil did step sectioning through these to try and demonstrate origin. Now remember, under TNM7, you are allowed to have a tumour deposit arising in extramural venous invasion or perineural invasion. So this is where the confusion lays. So if you see something that now you're convinced has an origin in one of these things, then you don't call it a tumour deposit anymore. You attribute it to the metastatic pathway. But he basically was, this was weighing on what version of TNM was applicable back then, TNM5 probably, and Neil was thinking about tumour deposits and discontinuous tumour and engagement of metastatic pathways long before that. So based on that evidence, this meta-analysis found 4 series of patients, 2 from Japan, 1 from the UK, 1 from Sweden, where there was detailed information on the nature of the recurrent disease evident. And they looked at the significance of tumour deposits on the recurrent disease. So I'll leave this up for a little bit to try and digest it. So basically, if we take the patients that didn't have any of these adverse features, no AMBI, no nodal involvement, no tumour deposits, and attribute to them a baseline risk of 1 for the development of liver, lung or peritoneal disease, and then comparing those within groups, if we look at the risk attributed to those with EMVI only, nodal disease or overt nodal disease only, or tumour deposits only, we can see that actually tumour deposits are more of an adverse feature or a greater predictor, particularly of peritoneal disease, so supporting Dr. Goldstein's paper compared to the other factors. So it's actually a worse prognostic factor. So remember now, TNM8 are saying ignore tumour deposits if you've got overt nodal disease. This would actually make you suggest that it would be the other way around. So basically the risk, we've got a hazard ratio of 6.44 for somebody with tumour deposits developing peritoneal disease over those without tumour deposits, assuming they're node negative. And even more impressive is if you look at the group where there is nodal disease and tumour deposits. And here we see the hazard ratios go up again for all 3 sites quite significantly. So the presence or absence of tumour deposits above and beyond nodal metastatic disease is of clinical significance, meaning that that TNM8 situation doesn't really provide the maximum information to the clinicians. And as the authors could produce valuable prognostic information by allocating tumour deposits into nodal category N1C and only considering tumour deposits in the absence of lymph node mets. So we'll see what happens in TNM9. But what's happening, certainly what we've done in the UK data set, is we now report tumour deposits regardless of the final. So we're following TNM8, and we'll call it N1A or N1B regardless of tumour deposits. But we will also give that information, and oncologists are aware and interested in the presence or absence of these things above and beyond just TNM stage. Then we're also recording, because you have to assess each of these parameters really to try and determine whether or not somebody has a tumour deposit or not. We thought, well, it's probably worth actually documenting each of these so that the evidence for reaching your assessment of any discontinuous tumour is fairly clear cut. In other words, if you have discontinuous tumour, there's now a home for it in the data set. It's either venous invasion, lymphatic invasion, perineural invasion, a lymph node met, or a tumour deposit. And of course you might tick some of more of these boxes than one. We're also recording the number of tumour deposits because there's some evidence out there to suggest that those with 8 tumour deposits do worse than those with 3. But that's pretty difficult in the absence of concrete criteria for minimum size and minimum separation from other deposits, as I discussed. And also, regardless of the tumour deposit story, there is evidence out there for the independent prognostic value of all of these different features. So tumour deposits we've discussed, but also even intramural vascular invasions, that's including small vessel lymphatic invasion is what we mean by lymphovascular in this context, and perineural. There's meta-analysis of each of these has shown them to be of prognostic significance. I'm just going to show evidence for one of these as an example, because it was the one that surprised me the most perhaps, the systematic review of the significance of perineural invasion reported in the American Journal of Surgical Pathology a couple of years ago. 58 studies looking at colonic and rectal, and they found 18% overall more common in rectal, particularly in more advanced stage, unsurprisingly. So 60% of stage 4 rectal cancer showed perineural invasion, and you see this in this chart that fairly consistent across a whole lot of studies. Both cancer-specific survival and overall survival was worse in those with perineural invasion, with a hazard ratio of just under 2 for each of them, quite similar to a lot of the prognostic features that we report routinely. So TNM8 rules, because it is a very confusing area, this, strictly speaking, we only call it a tumour deposit N1C if the patient is node negative. Only call it if we're not convinced. We can't convince ourselves. Clearly this is a subjective area, but I think we have pretty impressive agreement there as to how we were interpreting these foci. I generally find myself doing Desmond's and elastin stains anytime I'm thinking about it, so it's a lot of cases now. Anytime there's discontinuous tumour, I'm doing those basically. So we have to decide which of those categories we want to put this discontinuous tumour in, and if we can't convince ourselves of any of those categories, it goes in the tumour deposit basket. So there's no size rules anymore. We certainly don't add tumour deposits to the total number of involved nodes. And the other interesting thing was that they changed the rules subtly, but importantly, if you have clear-cut extramural venous invasion with extravascular extension, so like one of those foci where it was clearly venous invasion, but it was bursting out of the vein into the surrounding tissue, that used to increase the T stage, certainly under TNM5. I'm not sure when it changed over. But now you ignore that and you basically T stage only applies to the primary tumour. And the reason for that I think is quite sensible, because otherwise you're really counting that adverse prognostic factor twice. You're counting it in the T category and then you're also counting it in the N category, so, or the V category. So basically, if you think a discontinuous tumour focuses venous invasion or a tumour deposit, that doesn't affect the primary tumour's T stage. And really what we're getting at here, and I think that this is when the penny dropped for me about TNM8, so we're trying to, to basically identify pathways of metastatic disease engaged by the tumour. I think that's important. Yes?
Yes, I have a question. So does it mean that even for a patient without any lymph node metastasis, but we see for sure perineural invasion, can we also diagnose tumor deposits?
If you're convinced that that all of the foci of discontinuous tumour are related to perineural invasion, that's how it has ever happened to me, then, but strictly speaking, then it'd be the same as convincing yourself that they were associated with venous invasion. So if you're convinced that it looks like this discontinuous tumour has an origin in venous invasion or perineural invasion, then you don't call it a tumour deposit. Now sometimes, and not infrequently, I think you might get a little incidental nerve just at the corner or something, and you sort of think, well, that doesn't really look plausible that it has started off as that. I always think, well, it has to have started off as something. There's only a limited number of ways for the tumour cells to get into that place, so it has to have an origin in lymphatic venous or perineural. But we're just not making it up anymore. We're not saying, oh, well, there's 3 millimetres or more that must have arisen within a node. You know, we're actually trying to be dogmatic and say and convinced that that is related to one of those pathways, and if we're not, then we call it tumour deposit. So it's a judgment call, and that's the thing I find trickiest, I must say, in practice is I do an elastin stain, and there's a little bit of wispy elastin, but it's not particularly concentric or linear, and I'm thinking, how convinced am I that that is a residual vein wall? Those are kind of the practical things I find in practice. But strictly speaking, if you're convinced that you can identify an origin for the tumour deposit, it's not a tumour deposit anymore.
I mean in this one, but I mean the whole specimen. If we have perineural invasion,
yeah,
here and here and here,
yeah,
no lymph nodes metastasis, and here something which looks like tumour deposit. Is it possible to?
Oh, yeah. Then you're ticking both boxes, and that's very common. Okay. So the example that I showed 5 different areas from, so that's, you're ticking nearly everything, and that's very, very common. I think that when you see tumour deposits elsewhere, you will see.
Invasion.
Yeah, well, perineural maybe less commonly, but certainly tumour deposits plus EMVI plus nodal disease, and those are the bad ones.
Okay.
But you do tend to see them in isolation. I think it's pretty rare, which is why we're only actually reporting PM1C in probably about 5% of cases, because usually there are nodes involved. And even more, usually there's venous invasion. That's pretty convincing, I think. Personally, I think that the EMVI, that the tumour deposits are EMVI gone bad. So basically, I think that would explain everything very nicely, because, so if you have venous invasion, that's obviously bad news, but if you have venous invasion that is, then the tumour has developed the capacity to destroy the vein and grow out of it, then you're not going to be able to identify the originating vein, and you have a worse prognosis and maybe an increased risk then of it actually penetrating the peritoneal surface and developing peritoneal disease. So I think that's the most likely explanation for tumour deposits for me. So this is how I approach these now. I'm going to report them. The first thing I'm doing at a practical level, a new case of colorectal cancer comes to me, I'm actually scanning around the tumour. Is this all confined to one tumour mass? And if it is, then I'm thinking, great, I can report this today. If it's not, I'm ordering Desmonds and EVGs on anything that I'm not happy in the H&E is clearly related to a node or a vein in practice. So any of these things, then I'm basically downing tools, ordering these stains, and then evaluating them again. So if I'm thinking about tumour deposits, those are the two stains I'm ordering. And then, I go back to the interpretation, it's all about this convincing yourself of the origin of this discontinuous tumour, and these are the features that we're using to try and make that call. As I say, most commonly there would be elastin and Desmond for vein versus tumour deposit. Rarely some of those other stains, I don't do D240 or S100 routinely. And really tumour deposits are almost a diagnosis of exclusion once you haven't convinced yourself. Look at that. So that's how I'm handling those. And I forgot to say that often the easiest and most useful thing to do, you're ordering them, and then actually order another H&E level after that section, and that then shows you a capsule with a bit of subcapsular lymphoid tissue at the same time as your negative Desmond and EVG. So actually that is probably often just as useful as the additional stains. Does that bear any resemblance to what you're doing? How does that tally with your approach to applying TNM8 and tumour deposits? To how often are you calling things stage PN1C disease, for example?
I think we don't do immunohistochemistry so much for finding the rate of cells found there.
So you just make the assessment on H&E, and mostly. And do you call things tumour deposits quite commonly?
No.
No, not too often. Yeah, I mean, I think the evidence is pretty compelling of their significance, I must say. But we've, so I work in a department that's really subspecialised. There's maybe about half a dozen of us GI pathologists, and over the last year or more, we've evolved, and I personally evolved in how we've approached these and different thresholds for calling things, and but I think that kind of approach to multi-header discussion of cases, and you call that venous invasion, nobody would do this, is very useful to try, and at the very least you're getting standardisation within your department. I think that's a lot to be said for it, as opposed to the pathologist that does the MDM, that's the only opinion that counts kind of situation, which isn't healthy. Okay, so TNM8 has also tweaked the M classification of disease, and this is on the back of awareness that, of course, oligometastatic disease to either lung or liver or even both is a very different disease from that with peritoneal involvement or more extensive disease to other organs, because we now aggressively target patients who have got limited metastatic disease in these organs, particularly to the liver. And I'm sure same practice here, where basically the liver surgeons are much more enthusiastic about chasing and resecting nets, and you have patients with M1 disease that can live for many, many years after repeated resections. I presume that's the same. You get a lot of resections of liver nets here. Yes, no, yes, some cases. Yeah, certainly it seems to change all the time. At a very practical level, talked about the importance of MDMs earlier. One of the reasons that can fall down is because of the breakdown in communication between the MDMs or groups around these sorts of patients, because you've got a colorectal MDM, a liver MDM, a lung MDM, and if you have a patient then who may or may not have resectable disease, it's really the liver MDM is the only one placed, well enough placed to make a call on that, because often they say, well, we can do segmentectomy here, and we can apply chemoembolization to this one, and RFA to this, and so a bewildering array of options now. It's a bit like rectal surgery. There's such an array of options that it's a very specialised area, and it's to actually just dismiss a patient as having unresectable liver disease without involving that MDM is becoming very difficult in our practice. So we're trying to formally engage with a liver MDM to try and do that, but it's an issue. So the most adverse prognostic metastatic pathway is if you've got peritoneal disease, and that's really pretty difficult. But it's important to identify because there are trials out there looking at different peritoneal chemotherapy and aggressive peritoneal stripping in selective cases. Although generally I think that's, to my knowledge, most applicable in the low-grade malignancy like your appendiceal tumours with pseudomyxoma. But there is some movement towards extending that to colonic cancer as well. Okay, so in the next section I thought it was could move away from colorectal. Just this is well away from that goal, but I just thought, well, this is probably, I think, the most, maybe the next or one of the most important areas of reporting that's contentious, and I think we can make a big difference in clinical practice. So this was going to talk about reporting PT1 cancers and how we do that. So I don't know if this is as big a deal as it is in Poland as it is in the UK, but you've got a screening program, don't you? There's a national screening program, and it's based on FOB or FIT, or what's the protocol for screening? Is it population based? Do people get kits in the post, or how is screening organised in Poland? No, is it just?
No, we just received the volumes.
Oh, okay. So there is a screening program, but you're okay. So it'll be the patients or the participants will get. Okay, so
who is invited?
Okay, so they will get in the post some form of kit and invitation to participate, and it'll be either fecal occult blood or fecal immunochemical testing. Yeah, and I'm guessing. Have you heard of FIT testing?
No.
Okay, so it's actually interesting. And the early thought about putting a talk together on biocancer screening, because that's another area I'm very interested in, but I thought there's probably only so long you guys can listen to me for. But bio screening is actually, it's important and interesting because of the huge variety of different ways there are to screen for colorectal cancer. So you can use either looking for blood in the stool, which FOB has been around the longest, and then FIT, which is basically it's fecal immunochemical testing. So it's better than FOB because it's specific for human blood, and therefore you're less likely to get false positives based on diet, for example, and so on. So because it's more specific, and also the practicalities, we won't go into the detail, but the practicalities of the test kit make it easier to do, and therefore very important that you get a higher uptake. So significantly higher uptake, maybe 60% instead of 50%, and that makes a huge difference to the success of a screening program, because if nobody returns the kits, you're not going to find many cancers. But basically either of these will generate then a colonoscopy invitation for the participant. And those are the most common programs. You can have flexible sigmoidoscopy programs, you can have colonoscopy programs, but they're not really at a population level. But they generate, the point is they generate a whole lot of these polyps or possible polyp cancers, and that's probably, you're presumably seeing a lot of these, yes? Yeah, these kind of issues. And there are two big issues with these. One is making the distinction between the pseudo-invasion or epithelial misplacement versus polyp cancer, and that's the first issue aspect of the talk. And then once you make a diagnosis of a polyp cancer, then who needs further treatment? So those are the two issues that I want to address here. And I like this, especially for a non-pathology audience, I like this slide, because to a non-pathology audience, these two polyps look pretty much identical, don't they? But you all know, of course, that one's benign, one's malignant. Yeah, I'm not going to insult you by asking you which is which. You can see the cancer going into the head of the polyp here, and here we have very limited sort of pseudo-invasion or lobulation misplacement of glands within the head. So it's amazing the reaction from a non-pathology audience when you say one of these is cancer and one of these is benign. So there's a whole lot of pathological features that we can use to try and distinguish these two. It's pretty tedious in listing them all here. The point I only want to make is that not any one of these is useful, and you can gather by the use of the word usually that Neil stuck into this table so many times. And even the only factor that apparently is diagnostic by its presence or absence, lymphatic or venous invasion, it is important to be aware that again this can be fraught with difficulty if you look at this area in higher power, because occasionally you can find a little gland in a vessel. Now this is a tubular adenoma. Nobody's going to call this tubular adenoma with venous invasion, but if you had a PT1 cancer in this setting, you just might think, oh, there's a focus of venous invasion, which of course would be a significant trigger to potential surgery. So it's just to be aware that you can get this vascular intrusion that may not be genuine venous invasion, and just consideration of other features and cytology and so on is important. So here's a nice clear-cut example, to me anyway, of florid pseudo-invasion with all this lobulation, displacement, mucin extravasation, hemorrhage, and this is fairly classical pseudo-invasion, and what we're trying to do is not to call this PT1 cancer. Just a higher power of the same features. And then in contrast, I think this glandular proliferation lacks lobulation, seems to be destructive, and is growing on it, quite a pushing front into this rather sessile polyp. A stain, again, you think there's some particular interest in desmin, but I find that desmin stains to demonstrate destruction of the muscularis mucosae quite helpful. If you have misplacement, you will often get retention and lobulation of the desmin in these sort of areas, so destruction of desmin can be very useful adjunct to making a diagnosis of a PT1 cancer. Here's another example of the same. Most of this just looks like big sessile tuberous adenoma, and it'll follow the line of muscularis mucosae all the way around here, and then it gets a little blurred at this area. And if you look at that in higher power, again, it's just a bit difficult. High-grade dysplasia, possibly stromal reaction, and desmin. Put that in higher power, I do. Looks destroyed in this area, and this supports the diagnosis of an early PT1 cancer arising within a large sessile adenoma. But there are always cases that are frankly impossible. We usually illustrate them with cases that we're confident about, and this one really split the camp in our case. You notice it's a resection specimen. This was actually an incidental finding in somebody that had a more advanced cancer elsewhere, with this huge big lobulated misplacement, and then a slightly more infiltrative look that possibly, it's hard to know if we would call that a desmoplastic stromal reaction or not. Personally, I think it's probably all benign, but it was a difficult one, and you will always have these cases. The bowel cancer screening program in the UK or in England set up this so-called expert board of 3 pathologists to help with such cases, so they would get referral cases sent in, and they get 256 over 5 years, and reported on these a couple of years ago. And if we restrict the analysis to those in which there was 3-way agreement in the diagnosis, and we look at these 200 cases, the 59 benign diagnoses made by the originating pathologists were confirmed in 90% of cases, and the 61 malignant diagnoses made by the original pathologists were confirmed in only 31%. So where there was agreement between the 3 experts, they overturned the malignant diagnosis in 70% of cases, which is pretty striking. So the take-home message for me when I'm giving this talk to a UK audience was that if you were thinking about sending one of these cases off to the expert board, always call them benign, because they're much more likely to agree with you. But as a serious point, we mitigate against this obvious risk by mandating double reporting of polyp cancers or PD1 cancers now in all cases in bowel screening, and hopefully that extends to the symptomatic practice as well. Not just for the primary diagnosis, but also with the other features that may or may not trigger surgery. And I think that's a good practice. And just in my jurisdiction in Northern Ireland, I've introduced this new quality parameter for all bowel screening pathologists, whereby I look at the ratio or the proportion of all screen-detected cancers reported by individual pathologists and see what percentage often were PT1s So basically, if you have a high proportion of PT1s, then that may suggest that there's a degree of overcalling in your PD-1 cancers, because if it's the same population as if it's only bowel screening, there should be no other reason why you're seeing more than your peers. And we've generally found that it's quite uniform with the odd, and because we do so much double reporting, of course that should again standardise it. So I find it very reassuring when it's a uniform measure, and it's been uniform for all of us now for a while. I'll say 20 bowel screening pathologists in Northern Ireland. But we did find a few peaks, and when we explored them further, we found that it was pathologists who weren't double reporting. And basically there were pathologists that calling things PD-1 cancer that were quite clearly in some cases benign, others of course difficult, but I find that a useful quality parameter. What we do need are better biomarkers to try and give us black and white results as to when something is invasive versus benign. So this image was shown to me a few months ago by a researcher at home that I do some work with, and he basically had two cohorts of PT1 cancers, those that recurred and those that didn't. So obviously it's pretty hard to get recurrent cases, and he did about 30 or 40 of them, got a matched set that didn't recur, and based on gene expression profile patterns, he identified some markers that were differentially expressed between these two. He found an antibody existed to one of them, and he applied this antibody to a few PT1 cancers, and then showed me this image and said, what do you think of it? What do you think of it? I was quite, my first glance reaction was that it was an artifact. And then my next, I just really looked at higher power, I thought, this is quite impressive, because there seems to be an abrupt switching off, a bit like MLH1 and the dysplastic SSL, an abrupt switching off at the point of transition either to high-grade dysplasia or invasion. And I thought, this is just the sort of biomarker we need, maybe a marker like this that will actually identify the molecular event that is associated with the cancer's ability to invade. So I was pretty excited about it. We did it in a few more cases, of course. None of them were as good as this, but some of them definitely worked. So it could be an adjunct that's useful in a subset of cases, although I actually think that the transition, maybe more impressively, the transition looks more like it's happening at low grade to high grade than high grade to invasion, so which of course is not nearly as useful. And of course I'm sworn to secrecy as to the name of the antibody, because this guy hasn't published it yet, but it's definitely, that's the sort of biomarker we need that could help in practice. Okay, so once we've made a confident diagnosis of PT1 cancer, then we have to work out the risk of regional lymph node metastatic disease, trying to balance that against the morbidity and rare mortality associated with surgical operation. So this can be a balance depending on the risk factors there and on the patient's fitness, but I think it's an important point because we need to get away from the MDM that I started servicing before I went to about 5 years ago. There was no pathology input, and basically there were surgeons that liked to operate on their PT1 cancers and there were surgeons that didn't. So there was no refinement by pathology input. It was just, if your polyp cancer landed when this surgeon was on, you got an operation. If your polyp cancer landed when this surgeon was on, you didn't. So we always trying to then just introduce refinement along these lines as to what features may or may not predict lymph node metastatic disease. 3 or 4 meta-analyses in recent years have shown that lymphatic invasion keeps coming up as the most significant factor. But there's this long list, some of which are in routine practice, others aren't, but lymphatic invasion is always most important. And here, back to this polyp cancer again, which I like, because I don't know if any of you have spotted this already, but that focus shows very nice lymphatic invasion, which again at D240 stain would highlight this endothelium, but not this venous endothelium, confirming that, but I don't really think we need it. That's very clear from H&E. So that's the sort of one where that one strong adverse feature, even though there are no other adverse features in this, would push this patient towards surgery. It's hard sometimes to work out the relative contribution of different adverse features because they can often coexist. So this more sessile cancer looks quite substantial in terms of width of invasion, Kikuchi level, of course, we know it's difficult to apply because you don't have a muscularis propria, you don't know if it should be here or here. So is this Kikuchi SM2 or 3? But it's probably more than Kikuchi SM1. But the tumour is pretty differentiated. And we've got this rounded thing, which looks to me like a vein. Or a tumour concept. In this context, we call this venous invasion. So this patient, based on these two features, we can go back and look at this, we can see that there's high-grade histology, vascular invasion, which interestingly, you see here, so these are good studies, some of them only talk about vascular invasion in the round, others distinguish venous from lymphatic. So vascular and venous being interchangeable, and nice to see that lymphovascular invasion had an intermediate risk about halfway between vascular and lymphatic for the risk of lymph node metastatic disease. So very nice kind of intuitive dialogical thing. Vascular invasion, of course, can be an adverse prognostic feature that's worse than lymphatic invasion, but just doesn't predict lymph node metastatic disease. Perhaps it more predicts recurrent disease in liver, for example. So here we've got high-grade histology, which is a risk factor for nodal disease and venous invasion. So based on those two factors, this patient went on to have surgery. And interestingly, the only residual tumour in the specimen was at the polypectomy site, which had healed over. It suddenly goes to fibrosis, and then we have this ton of extramural venous invasion just headed immediately south from the site of polypectomy. That was the only residual disease in that specimen. Okay, and then the last and perhaps most contentious area in PT1 cancers is around margin assessment. And the question is, how much margin of clearance is enough in the context of a polypectomy with a cancer in it if you don't have any other adverse features? So the interest in this area came about because in the bowel screening practice I've noticed quite a few patients, maybe you have as well, who had that sole adverse feature of margin involvement, went to have surgery, no residual tumour. It was a very, very common finding in my practice, or not so much my practice, but looking at data across Northern Ireland where we had a PT1 database in bowel screening, and it showed quite a few patients having surgery. Maybe we were doing surgery in over 50% of patients with PT1 cancers, and on a lot of occasions the only adverse feature triggering surgery was margin involvement. And they never seem to have any residual disease locally or nodal metastatic disease. So this is the best. There's very little data out there on this sort of thing because it just doesn't exist or it hasn't been put together. This is one of the largest and possibly the best series from a crowd in Queensland. And they did a very detailed pathology review of all of their PT1 cancers. And in their hands, the biggest predictors of nodal metastatic disease were poor differentiation and the width of invasion. So there's different ways of assessing quantitatively width and depth. It's a bit problematic because these are kind of arbitrary cut-offs, so I think it's hard to turn that into practice. But certainly it's something that I would pay attention to now is the actual width of invasion, perhaps more than depth. But anyway, in their hands, poor differentiation, width of invasion were the two risk factors most predictive of lymph node metastatic disease. Positive resection margin wasn't significant, and they led them to suggest that a positive margin was not associated with nodal mets and might be adequately treated by local endoscopic excision. So this is something that we tried to bring into national guidelines for bowel screening in the UK. On balance, there wasn't considered to be enough evidence to make a firm ruling about changing the 1 millimetre rule, which has been the default, extrapolated from the rectal cancer setting to the polypectomy setting. We wanted to make that 0 millimetres, or thought about making it 0 millimetres, but thought maybe instead what we do is we provide a bit of, we try to be more conservative in our measurement to the margin. So what we mean by that is you get a lot of diathermy artifact and it can destroy millimetres and millimetres of tissue, and the endoscopist sometimes talks about a tumour or a polyp on a stalk that's a centimetre and it's disappeared in the lab and there's nothing left behind. And clearly the diathermy destroys a lot of the tissue. probably in the polyp and in the residual tissue, which is the explanation why we don't see anything left behind locally, slightly positive margin. So what we suggested was, because of the awareness of the diathermy zone, which can be, as you see here, up to several millimeters thick, we should be first of all trying to ignore any artifactual fragmentation of the margin. So you get this vaporization as part of the diathermic process where gases come in and disrupt this tissue. And don't measure from the nearest bit of tumour to the nearest white space, but actually try to estimate where the true margin should be and measure to the outer aspect of that diathermy zone. And if you do that, you generally find that the only time you call a positive margin is when tumour cells start to melt into the diathermy. Now, of course, once that happens, it's pretty impossible to make an accurate measurement, but it removes the measuring, and you're basically trying to make the assessment of, can I confidently say there's a clear zone here, a clear zone between the edge of the tumour and the diathermy? And if so, then it's R0. So formally, it's still a 1 millimetre rule in our hands, but we're trying very hard to call things R1 less often for that reason. And in practice, when I do call something R1, if there aren't any other features, if it does go into the diathermy zone, I'd be saying that MDM, there probably is nothing left here. If it's a smallish tumour, maybe just go back and have a look at the endoscopy site in the first instance and not recommend surgery. And I think our overall surgical resection rate for polypectomies, PT1s, has dropped from 50% now to 40% on the back of that, so we're not really doing as much surgery for PD1 cancers as we used to, and I think that's probably a good thing. Has anybody any feel for that kind of approach here? What's happened in your practices about how much surgery, how often does a PD1 cancer go on to have surgery, or your assessment of the margin? Your experiences. Anybody? I suppose if you don't have, maybe you don't have a good feel for bowel screening data, specifically, so it's more. But say that even in the symptomatic, you don't know whether it's screening or symptomatic. If you get a PD1 cancer, do they usually have surgery, or they usually don't have surgery? Or would it be dependent on those features, or would it be dependent on the surgeon's fondness for operating in that context? No? Do you see many polyp cancers in general? Are you getting a lot? Is the issue of making the diagnosis problematic, or are they all easy? Do you share? Do you double report? No. Is that just practice as, I mean, even informally double report? Surely you show cases to colleagues and...
Yes, of course.
Don't formally do it, yeah, don't co-sign with you, but informally do it. Yeah, well that's, it's just formalise it, makes it happen in every case, then I think it's useful. So margin assessment is important. And maybe just a few take-home rules on that clearly if they send the polypectomy and piecemeal, don't bother try and assess the margin. It makes life easier for us, and also encourages them to try and remove these things intact. So I think that's just an easy thing to do. If it's piecemeal, we can't comment on the margin, don't ask us. We can't put the pieces of the jigsaw back together again. That diathermy is only millimetres thick. Be conservative in the measurement, I think. Ignore the clefting artifacts, and in practice, if we see tumour in that diathermy zone, and sometimes an immunostain, keratin, or an increasingly I like now just do a CDX2, and that might highlight little bits of tumour that are really distorted, but in the diathermy zone, and that defines your R1 or gives you reassurance that there's no tumour in the zone. So I'm doing that more and more often now, actually. And we still have a 1 millimetre rule efficient. Okay, so with that we've covered, I think, important changes to colorectal cancer reporting introduced by TNM8, and some ideas as to what's coming in this WHO Blue Book edition that should be out possibly any week now, and then the important issue of PD1 cancers and risk assessment. What time did we start? 4:30. So I also have a talk on molecular pathology, but I'm guessing you guys have had enough. So I think we will stop it there, and thank you very much for your input, and we shall see you later on at dinner,
Can I have a question?
by all means.
I was wondering, in theoretical specimens, if you report a little more value,
So personally, I'm not a big fan. We did one study at home, and we found it hopelessly reproducible. So, and the issue, that, and I think many papers have sort of fallen out with people over this, who are big budding enthusiasts, is the selection of the field. And I just think that if you have a tumour and you have taken 5 or 6 or 7 blocks off it, you might find an area where there's obvious budding in some tumours, but most of them doesn't jump out. And it knows which field do you use to start trying to count buds by this very complex method that has been suggested. And the selection of field, and most of the studies, they'll have, we retrieved 200 tumours, and we selected a representative block from each, and then we sent it to 4 participants. So you've already narrowed the 5 or 6 blocks down to 1 or 2, making life easier. And yes, it's clearly important. I have to say, if it's there in a PT1 cancer, and mention it. If it's there in an overt colorectal cancer, it is not going to influence my oncologist to do anything differently if it's the sole prognostic adverse feature, even if it's there and very overt. I generally find that when it's there, I also can find lymphatic invasion and nodal disease, that the